Have you ever heard the question, if God knows everything, could you do anything differently? So if God knew I was going to wear this shirt out of my closet, and God doesn't have any mistakes, God knows everything is always true, and his knowledge is infallible, is it possible that I could have worn a different shirt? Well, that's going to be the subject of our discussion now. We are going through Ronald Nash's book, The Concept of God, and we're looking at divine attributes, and we are on chapter 4, divine omniscience and human freedom. He defines divine omniscience this way. He says, divine omniscience means that God holds no false beliefs. I don't like that definition because it's theoretically possible, although highly unlikely, that that doesn't happen. But it's at least rationally possible that there could be a human who maybe didn't have very many beliefs, but they happened to all be right. Or he didn't think a whole lot, but when he did, he was always right. Well, that hardly seems to mean that person is omniscient. Now, to be fair to Nash, he does go on and continues to say that not only are all of God's beliefs true, the range of his knowledge is total. Okay, so that's better. So we're not staying at the level of God has no false beliefs. That's a typical definition for divine omniscience. The word omniscience from two Latin words, omni for all or every, and science from scientia meaning knowledge. The word science, like with biology, means knowledge. So that's what normally, or a lot of times, people mean by divine omniscience, whether they mean that God has no false beliefs or that God knows all true propositions. And I think that Nash goes on to even say that God knows all true propositions. So there's a lot going on in this chapter. We're not going to look at everything in equal depth. I want to get some of the highlights out of this chapter. And we're looking at God's knowledge. So there are a couple of different areas or questions we have to ask. One is not only what does it mean for God to have knowledge, but what does it mean to have knowledge in general? We're not going to go through a full-blown epistemology of what it means to have knowledge. For example, and he does mention some of these views in here. He doesn't name them by name all the time or give it a lot of depth, and he says he can't give it. And it's fair to him that he can't go into a lot of depth, like we're not going to here. But epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, has historically said that if you have a justified true belief, you have knowledge. If you're justified in believing something, you do believe it, and it's true, then you are said to have knowledge. Well, in 1963, that view got wrecked by Edmund Gettier, who was told by his department chair or someone in his chain of command at school, you need to publish and publish now. And that's one thing you got to do in academia. You got to publish and publish often. Well, he wrote probably the shortest little article probably in the history of philosophy. It was about a 1.5 page, a 3-page article, real short, that just destroyed epistemology as we know it. And people have been trying to, epistemologists have been trying to redefine knowledge ever since then, either by saying that it's JTB plus something, or just going to a whole nother way of talking together. And a lot of times people don't even talk about knowledge anymore. They talk about justification or warrant or other things like that. So there are, just know that there are various theories of what it means to know something and have knowledge. We're going to use the term knowledge in the everyday sense in this discussion of what it means to know something. But another issue that comes up in this chapter and in this discussion on human freedom or divine sovereignty and divine knowledge and divine omniscience is human freedom. In other words, how, as I mentioned at the beginning of the segment, how can I have had any real freedom not to wear this shirt if God is infallible in all that he knows and he knew I was going to wear this shirt? So how does he have and this goes beyond the Calvinist Arminian debate, because all different systems. There are other systems besides Calvinism and Arminianism. And it's the question of if God knows something, there's no way, and if he's omniscient, there's no way that thing is not going to come to pass. It's going to come to pass. It's going to happen. So then how does God's knowledge relate to that thing coming to pass? Well, there are different theories as how to go about understanding that and explaining that. And one is called compatibilism, which says that our freedom is in some way compatible with some kind of divine determinism or God's knowledge of things, where he knows something's going to happen or come to pass. So for those philosophers, and right now I am one of them, who hold to compatibilism, the compatibilist says that our human freedom is not inconsistent with God having infallible knowledge of what we are going to do. And incompatibilists, by contrast, would say that there is some kind of contradiction or logical problem with God knowing event X and the person involved in event X being free if God already knows that event X is going to happen. So incompatibilists think that there is a contradiction between God having full-blown knowledge of what's going to happen, or any kind of determinism, as well as being coupled with human freedom. So they think that you can't be free. Now, we could spend a whole nother video, and probably will one time, talking about what human freedom means. There are different schools of thought as to what it means to be free, and Nash talks about them in some way. So one view of being free is more of a libertarian view of being free. He calls it the liberty of indifference, which means that you have the real choice to mow your grass or not mow your grass, or do action A or not do action A. And that's liberty of indifference, or normally what's considered libertarian freedom. The other he calls liberty of spontaneity, which means that you can do whatever you want to do. You just don't want to do certain things. So, for example, in John 6, Jesus says that no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Well, you could say that if you're a libertarian, you can say, well, everyone has the choice to come or not to come. For whatever reason, they either do or don't come. And then those who hold to what Nash calls the liberty of spontaneity says, well, yeah, everyone is free to come, but they just don't want to. And this was made popular in my own reading by Harold Gerstner in a little book, a primer called, I think it's called A Primer on Free Will. They explain that well. And actually, guys, that was just Gerstner saying that you're free to do whatever you want to do, but you're not free to have certain desires. So if you're a sinner, you're not going to have the desire to come to Christ, for example. So there are different ways of cashing out what human freedom really means, or even divine freedom. Does God have freedom if he can't sin? If he's always going to do the good, always, is he really free? What does it mean for God to be free? There are different systems to try to explain how we can say that God has knowledge of all things and humans be free or not be free. Okay. The traditional model, dare I say the classical model, is that God is eternal or atemporal or atemporal. And that is the idea, and this comes, this is defined by Boethius in a book called On the Consolation of Philosophy. He was imprisoned for supposedly committing treason, and he was writing a book called On the Consolation of Philosophy. Philosophy was consoling him. Lady Wisdom philosophy was consoling him. And he wrote that basically for God to be eternal means that he possesses all of his unlimited life all at once. So if you've got children or you have people in your life that you love, every day we're all getting older. So I have children, and they're not the age they were last week, last month, last year. So you may miss certain times in your life. You may say, well, I miss my college days, or I miss being able to do this or that. You're not getting that back. We're not going to get our age back. Say I miss being 30 or 20, or I'm not getting that age back anymore. That's just done. Well, there's nothing about God that's done. If for him to be eternal means that he has all of his life simultaneously. He is completely himself. He has complete life, complete being all at once. And he's not in a succession of moments. This is the classical definition of eternal. It doesn't mean what people normally say regarding eternal, that we're eternal, that we'll be with God for eternity. We'll be with God in an everlasting sense in that regard. Everlasting means unending. So something can be everlasting in the future if it doesn't ever end. And that's not what Boethius meant with eternity. He meant that God is eternal in the sense that there is no succession of moments like there are successions of moments for you and me. So we'll never have eternity like God does in that sense of being atemporal. Okay, there's a sense in which we'll enjoy the eternity of God because Jesus says that we will have eternal life, but it doesn't mean we'll have timeless life in that regard. That we'll have in some way be tethered to God, but not exactly in the way that He is in Himself. So that's the eternal, classical, Thomistic understanding, classical traditional way of understanding God and His relationship to creation is that He is eternal, and He has eternally willed and created all things in one act of creation. Another model, and Ronald Nash seems to hold to this model, is called Open Theism. Open Theism is the idea that the future is open. This is also called openness theology, open theology. And this view says that God knows everything. He is omniscient because He knows all things that can be known. But the future, since it hasn't happened yet, because they reject the notion of God being eternal, is not a thing to be known. So God knows all things that can be known. He just doesn't know the future because it's not a thing that can be known. So God knows all that can be known, so He can be said to be omniscient. And Nash explains it like this is kind of like how Aquinas explains God being omnipotent. That God can do all things that can be done. He can't make a square circle. He can't make the past not exist, but He can do all things that can be done. So open theists take that same kind of thinking and say, well, God knows all things that can be known. He knows all about things that can be known, but some things can't be known. So because they can't be known, God isn't at fault for not knowing them. Okay. Then there is a very popular, now at the writing of Nash, he says it wasn't very popular. Well, this is written in 1983. Here we are in 2023. So 40 years later, that has changed. And I think it's changed because of a couple people. But this next view is called Molinism. Molinism. It's not the study of moles. It is the view patterned after Louis de Molina. I always want to say Alfred Molina, the famous actor who played Doc Ock, or John Tetzel in Luther. It wasn't Alfred Molina, it was Louis de Molina. And this view says that God can know everything and we can be free. So for open theists, we're free because God just doesn't know the future. So God can't know this. So we're acting freely. Well, for a Molinist, God has different kinds of knowledge. Okay, so one, He has knowledge of things that must be, and that's called natural knowledge. So God has knowledge of all things that are necessary, like Himself, or mathematical truths, or logical truths. That all falls under natural knowledge. Then on the other end of the spectrum is what's called free knowledge. Nash has a different word for that. He calls that simple vision. So free knowledge for him is simple vision. So that's what God has decreed. God has that's the way the world really is. So His free knowledge is just the way the world works. So I'm wearing this shirt, you're wearing that shirt, where you're sitting wherever you are doing whatever. That's what actually is happening in this world. So that's called free knowledge, because God was free to bring these events about. In the middle of natural knowledge and free knowledge, kind of in between natural and free, is what's called middle knowledge, because it's in the middle of natural and free knowledge. And middle knowledge is all the knowledge God has of things that would be the case if he brought about that world or those set of circumstances. So this view really pulls on a philosophical way of talking called possible world semantics. And it's a way of talking about the nature of necessity and possibility. And a lot of philosophers use possible world semantics. Some philosophers have problems with it and don't like it, but some like it very much. And most philosophers don't think that these let me rephrase that. Most philosophers don't think that these possible worlds really exist or are actual. There is one philosopher, at least, who thinks that they all are actual, and that's David Lewis. But most philosophers, as Bill Craig says, use this kind of talking as a heuristic device, just a way of talking about the nature of possibility and necessity. So a possible world is simply all the different possibilities that could have been but aren't. So it's possible that I wore a red shirt, not this kind of blue and white checkered shirt. It's possible that I could have made this video on Saturday and not on Sunday. But so that would have been a different world. So there is a possible world in which I wore that shirt or did the video on a different day or whatever. So that's all that's meant there most of the time. All right, so Molinism really pulls hard on possible world semantics. All right. I will no doubt have more videos both on open theism and on Molinism at a later time. There are problems with both. Open theism has problems because, well, it rejects these classical views of God because they think that these views are based on pagan Greek thinking. A couple of problems with that. One is that there is no monolithic view of Greek thinking. You can also find Greek thinkers who thought that God was finite, like these open theists do, who didn't know things, who were in time, physical. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, as the saying goes. And they also just eschew philosophy in general. But it's hard. Open theism has a lot of problems, and one is saying that God takes risk and doesn't know things, and that just seems unbiblical and has a lot of philosophical problems. Molinism has problems too, and I'll go into more detail on this in it because this is a very popular view now. Naturally, it wasn't. In 1983, it might not have been. But Alvin Plantinga, a very well-known Christian philosopher, probably the most well-known Christian philosopher of our time, and Bill Craig, William Lane Craig, another very well-known Christian philosopher, has made Molinism very popular. Now, Plantinga is not a Molinist per se, but his view is very similar to it. Bill Craig is a champion of the Molinist view. A few things I think that are wrong with Molinism. One, and I think that Nash kind of gets at this. He doesn't say it quite the way that I would, but you really can't say Molinism is true. At best, you can say Molinism is one way of understanding how God's sovereignty and human freedom are possible. But you can't say Molinism is true because it's kind of a sort of an ad hoc way of explaining it. It's not really. It's just a possibility for how things could be explained. It's not a deduction like we can deduce divine simplicity or deduce divine immutability. It is just a way of postulating a way of thinking about God that may or may not be true. We just can't say for sure whether it is or not. I think we can say that it's not true, but if the Molinists have a hard time saying that it is true because there's not this deduction that you have with other attributes in the classical kind of model. Also, if you want to hold to a classical view of God, you really can't and be a Molinist, because if God has different kinds of knowledge, if there's a real distinction between natural knowledge, middle knowledge, and free knowledge, then there are real distinctions in God's being. Well, that's rejected if you hold to a divine simplicity and say there are no divisions or any kind of lines that divide God up. There's no real distinctions in God's essence. Furthermore, it would deny divine impassibility, which again says that God is not affected by his creation. Well, if God wants to say, for example, if God wants to will that Peter deny Christ at a certain time, As one open theist, didn't think I'd ever agree with an open theist. One open theist said, well, then God just gets lucky because those worlds happen to be possible. What if there wasn't a world where Peter denied Christ? Then God would not be able to use Peter. So what the Molinist wants to say is that God sees all the possible worlds and says, I want this one over here where Peter denies Christ. So God actualizes that world. Well, what if there is no world that has Peter denying Christ? Furthermore, it makes God's creative act dependent on the possible worlds, and God does not have anything to do. Craig actually admits this in about a year ago from the time of this recording, discussion debate with James White, and he admits that the God does not make these worlds possible; they're just possible in and of themselves. So God can only actualize a possible world if it is in itself possible, and he is dependent and somewhat reactive on what possible worlds are available to him. So that would deny divine impassibility. And there are other problems such as, can we really say that a proposition about the future, if we want to take the truth as a correspondence theory and say, well, I'm wearing a checker shirt. If I say that, then that statement is only true if, in fact, I am wearing a checkered shirt. Or if I say I am recording this on a camera. Well, that statement's only true if I am, in fact, only actually recording this on a camera. Well, that's fine because that view of truth says that statements correspond to reality. But in what sense are future events real? If they're not real, they have no reality and they wouldn't have any kind of correspondence to them. And so some people would say that these statements about the future have no grounding to make them real or have a correspondence. So people will oftentimes raise what's called the grounding objection to Molinism. Now, Molinism is a very popular view, so I'll do more on this later, but that's Nash goes into it here, so I wanted to at least touch on it. So we'll get more into divine omniscience as well going forward. In fact, the next chapter is on a couple of objections to omniscience, so we'll look at more there. But a couple of critiques I have for this chapter. I mentioned that I don't agree with everything in this book, but it's a short little clear book on different views, and it allows me to look at views that I think are opposite of my own in a lot of ways, and to clarify my view and to bring objections to views that are somewhat popular today. So one is that Nash and others try to arrive at a knowledge of God by way of answering problems rather than deducing what God is like from being. So, for example, a traditional classical thinker, usually, not all the time, because you got Anselm, who, for example, wants to just deduce what God is like from what he thinks is more perfect than not. But you got thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, for example. So Anselm is arguing more from an a priori, starting in the mind, working back to God, whereas someone like Aquinas would start with finite physical being and deduce God. So, if for example, if the universe is changing material and temporal, then you can't have an infinite number of causes that are changing material and temporal. So you got to have an ultimate cause that's none of those things. So then we get God being simple and immutable and eternal and impassible. And if you have all that, you have classical theism. So that's a deduction from finite being to what God is like. Well, Nash and others try to explain what God is like, not with some kind of a deduction from the creation, like Paul says we can know certain things about God from creation, but by trying to answer problems. Well, if we want to maintain that humans have free will, we've got to say God's like this. Well, what if our view of free will is wrong? Then you have a wrong view of God. It just isn't a good way to come about learning about God's nature and attributes. And I think my biggest complaint with Nash and others here is that God is often seen as just really a big human, kind of a superhuman. Back in 2019, I mentioned this before in other videos, a philosopher by the name of Peter Adderton wrote an article in the New York Times, in an op-ed piece, where he says that God cannot be simultaneously all knowing and all good, because If he was all-knowing, if he were all-knowing, then he would know what lust was like. But if he knows what lust is like, then he can't be all good. Well, that assumes that God knows things the way that we do, in a passive, kind of reactive sort of way. Well, a lot of theologians treat God as if he were a grand human, just a big, glorified, kind of superhuman. I would argue that God does not know things passively like we do. We know things because we hear, we see, we sense, and we taste, hear, smell, and touch, and all that kind of stuff. But if God is really pure act, like we said in our first discussion on the divine attributes, if he is all actual with no potential to be reactive or to be acted upon, then he can't know that way. If God's not a physical being, he also can't know through physical sensations that you and I have. Rather, and Nash discusses this somewhat in his chapter, following a view like Thomas Aquinas, God knows all things, both actual and possible, because he's the cause of all being. So he doesn't just know me because he's looking out there at me and taking in some kind of passive data, as it were, sensible or not. I don't know what it will be besides sensible or what else it could be. But God knows me and you and the world around us because he is not just the first cause of all things that exist, but he's the sustaining cause of all things that he doesn't just, unlike deism, which says that God creates something and just leaves it alone, like the clock example. In theism, God doesn't just begin creation, he upholds it and sustains it. So God didn't just will me when I was born. God is willing me now, or I wouldn't exist. He's willing you now and all the things around you, or we all wouldn't exist. So God is, he created, but he always upholds his creation. It's kind of like if I were to hold this book in my hand, if I let go of the book and remove my hand, the book's going to fall. Another example is if someone is singing a song, the notes carry as long as the vocalist is actually producing the notes. The notes cease to be once the person singing ceases to sing. So, yes, God ceased creating, as it were, on the seventh day, but he's sustaining all of us and upholding us in our existing, because we're contingent beings. That doesn't stop once we're created. We're contingent all of our existence. So God knows us not in a reactive, passive way, but in a very intimate way that he is actively and ultimately causing us to be every moment of our existing, every moment of our existence. So God doesn't look out, as it were. He actually knows us because he knows himself. And so as Nash says, his knowledge in this model is causal because he has knowledge coupled with his will. Therefore, he knows all things actual and possible. So this was a pretty dense chapter. It's an interesting chapter. It brought a lot of things in the mix. We have, he didn't call it this, but I think open theism, Molinism, the classical view of eternality, different views of human freedom, different views of knowledge, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot going on here. Hoping if you have questions, please ask in the comments. I'll be happy to answer what I can. And thanks for tuning in, and keep on going with me. If you don't have the book yet, it's not too late. Go ahead and grab the book. I'll put a link for it in the description, and see you next time.